I haven't posted here for about a month. And during this month, I was watching what's happening around the world. And I caught myself questioning something I talk about a lot these days, which is inclusion. For a moment, I wondered, do we really have to include everyone? Does everyone deserve inclusion? Because when you think about it, there is no clear law or universal rule that tells us who must be included and who shouldn't be. Inclusion isn't a checklist. It's not a policy document you can apply blindly. And when you look at how people use the word of inclusion today, sometimes feels like it means include everything, accept everything, tolerate everything. But that's when I realized something very important. That is, nothing in life works without boundaries. Even the most beneficial thing in the world have limits. Take a simple example, okay, like eggs. Eggs are good for you. They contain protein, vitamin, nutritions. But does that mean you should eat eggs all day, every day? Of course not. At some point you stop. Maybe your intuition tells you that balance matters, or maybe your body reacts and reminds you the hard way. Either way, the principle is very simple. Even good things require limits. And inclusion is no different. Real inclusion was never meant to mean accepting every behavior, every ideology, or every action without question. That would destroy the very condition and allow people to coexist safely. Inclusion is about dignity, respect, and making space for people. But it doesn't mean removing every boundaries. Because when boundaries disappear, inclusion stops protecting people and it will start protecting harm. So the real question isn't whether inclusion is right or wrong. The real question is, where are the boundaries that allow inclusion to survive? Because without those boundaries, inclusion doesn't become stronger, it collapses under its own weight. And during the time I was absent, I realized something else, and that was how misunderstood the idea of inclusion has become. Sometimes the word has been reduced to a very narrow conversation. When people hear inclusion, many immediately think about nationality, ethnicity, religion, or cultural background. Those things matter, no doubt. In a world where people move between countries and continents for education, work, safety, opportunities, learning how to live together across culture is essential. And inclusion in that sense is not optional. It's non-negotiable. It requires serious thought, education, and continuous efforts to make sure everyone feels safe and respected. But inclusion is much broader than that. It also includes differences in physical abilities, disabilities, gender, age, neurodiversity, socioeconomic background, educational backgrounds, language, personalities, belief system, political perspectives, and even differences in how people think, communicate, and process the world. In other words, inclusion is about human diversity in all its forms, not just heritage. And that's exactly why the conversation becomes sensitive and sometimes controversial. When a concept touches so many aspects of human identity and behavior, people inevitably interpreted it differently. But the controversy often comes from misunderstanding the concept itself. It includes many things, like if inclusion is clearly defined and properly understood, it becomes much less threatening and much more helpful and practical, because inclusion doesn't mean removing all limits. In fact, the survival of inclusion depends on understanding tolerance and its boundaries. Like everything else in life, tolerance has limits. Those limits are shaped by laws, social norms, and sometimes by something very personal and important, which is our moral compass. Societies create rules. Without them, cooperation becomes impossible. Social norms evolve because communication needs shared expectations to function. And individuals rely on moral judgment because not every situation can be solved within rules. So when we talk about inclusion, we also have to talk about what society can reasonably tolerate and what they cannot tolerate. Not because inclusion is weak, no, not at all, but because inclusion only works when it protects people, not when it protects harm unintentionally. So let me give you a simple example. Many of us want to be included because we are different in so many ways. We think differently, we have a different ability, maybe some of us are introvert in a world that often reward extroversion. Those differences matter, yes. An inclusive environment should recognize and respect them. But does that automatically mean we are entitled to special treatment in every situation? The simple answer is no. And the more honest answer is that inclusion is something we participate in together. One of the reasons I created this channel is because I truly believe there is very limited education about inclusion. People are often placed into diverse environments like schools, workplaces, and communities without ever learning how to navigate them. And there's no magic solution for it. No single rule that suddenly makes inclusion work everywhere exists. But there are ways to learn it. We can build awareness, we can practice empathy, and we can understand how to communicate across differences. It's possible. My intention here is to contribute to that awareness so that the space we move through every day feels safer and more respectful for everyone. But I also feel responsible for saying something that is often left out of the conversation. And that is, inclusion is not a one-way street. It involves responsibility from everyone involved. Let's imagine a simple situation. Suppose I'm vegetarian and I'm invited to a dinner where the host has prepared a menu that includes meat. If I never told them about my dietary choice beforehand, am I entitled to accuse them of being negligent or insensitive? No. I could have informed them earlier, or I could have politely declined the invitation. But expecting others to anticipate every possible differences without communication is unreasonable and unrealistic. Inclusion works when people communicate their needs and others make reasonable efforts to accommodate them. But it also means respecting the context you are entering. For example, if I am a vegetarian and I sit at a table with people who eat meat, condemning them for their choices wouldn't create inclusion. That would create chaos and conflict. Inclusion tries to create a space for people, but behaviors matter and boundaries matter even more. Because when any idea is pushed beyond its reasonable limits, it risks becoming something else entirely. Extremism is not limited to politics or ideology. It can appear in every conversation when balance disappears. Setting boundaries might sound natural, as if humans should instinctively know how to do it. But in reality, it's one of the most difficult skills to learn. If you take things too loosely, everything becomes chaotic. If you take things too rigidly, people will feel controlled and excluded. So moderation is the key. Balance is the key. I'm talking about it now because I think much of the confusion around inclusion comes from misunderstanding the balance. In many ways, we are still learning what inclusion truly means and how to practice it effectively. So conversations about its limits often are avoided. But ignoring those questions allow the concept to be misused or misunderstood, and that's not something we want. And when ideas are poorly understood, they easily become arguments instead of solutions. At its heart, inclusion is about creating psychologically safe environment, not creating unnecessary drama or unrealistic expectations. We want to include people, but we also expect people to respect the environment they enter. Sometimes rules guides us, sometimes social norm guides us, and sometimes we rely on something more personal, like our moral compass. Not everything in human life can be perfectly calculated or measured. Sometimes empathy, judgment, and basic humanity help us to decide how to behave towards one another. And that's very important. The goal of inclusion is very simple: to create a space where people feel respected, safe, and able to participate. And that goal requires awareness, empathy, and action from all of us. Because awareness doesn't come only from data or policies. It also comes from understanding human behavior and learning how to live with one another in a complex and diverse world. And maybe that is where the real work of inclusion begins, not in slogans or arguments, not in demanding space without responsibility, but in learning how to live together with respect, honesty, and balance. Inclusion is not about removing every boundary. It is about building environments where people feel safe, respected, and able to participate without fear of being dismissed, ignored, or harmed. But for that to work, boundaries must exist. Because boundaries protect dignity, boundaries protect fairness, and boundaries protect very space where inclusion can exist. Without them, inclusion becomes confusion. With them, inclusion becomes something much more powerful, which is a shared commitment to creating places where people can belong without demanding that others disappear. So as we continue this conversation here, my goal is simple: to explore inclusion more deeply and to question it honestly, and to learn where it works, where it struggles, and how we can participate it together and better. Because inclusion is not a finished data. It's something societies are still learning about it. And maybe the most important step is simply being willing to talk about it with clarity, curiosity, and a little bit more balance than we often see today. Welcome to Inclusion Matter.